And we are live, I think.
Yay.
Uh, Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. Um, and today we have quite a lot of freedom related news, actually, in as much as we've had a very good selection of articles put out by our members this week. So we start off with the Palestine Action getting a judicial review, which is something of a victory, I think. Um, the Online Safety Act coming into effect and the way in which it has gone horribly wrong in many ways. Not that anybody predicted that that would happen. There is the food inflation accelerating again, which is a lesser known story. That is our weekly FT story there for you. The TAV protest in Italy, which is their equivalent of HS2, except much longer running. I think it's over 30 years now that they've been at it and are still going strong with the protests. An uptick in far-right protesting, obviously because we are outside the football season. They are more organised than ever. There is trans pride and the success of that this year. There is the Handala being intercepted on its way to Gaza and anti-corruption protests in Ukraine. We may or may not get to all of them, but that is our general list. With me today, I have obviously Andy Micah, our regular legal eagle, who we can start off with talking about the Palestine Action judicial review and what on earth is going on this time.
Okie doke. Our gang, which two QCs and five other barristers, versus three QCs for the government, plus four assistant barristers for them, plus the special um, counsel who gets appointed by the courts because the government is relying on some what they say is secret information that can't be seen by our barristers. So it gets seen by other barristers who aren't really working for the government and but doing independent advice so that they can put things to the court that we can't see. Have
Doesn't
all
sound
got
shady at all.
together and had a great day out. And this is a hearing to decide whether we get permission to have a judicial review, which will be now sometime in the autumn, courtesy of Mr. Justice Chamberlain, who's a bit of a dodgy egg in the judiciary. He is a judge who wanted to leak the whole Afghanistan thing until he got told to shut up by more senior judges. Um, not sure who will do the actual hearing, which um, I, I think we're looking October, November, but date to be confirmed. Um, and it is good because we didn't expect to get as far as this. He's proved it on two grounds. Hasn't agreed the grounds, but he says that they need to be investigated. And that is ground eight, that Palestine Action wasn't actually consulted. So there should have been a fair and balanced inquiry and not talking to anyone in Palestine Action while you were talking to the Israeli government might be seen as a bit
It's
biased.
fairly
And
amazing that they even managed to get that far with it, to be honest.
yeah, and then there's the that it will disproportionately infringe people's human rights to protest and freedom of expression. We'll come to freedom of expression in the next item as well. Um, they the government's own account says that only three of 385 identified Palestine actions would qualify as terrorism. So that there's something to work with there, even if it's only getting us a big dose of publicity of it making the government look ridiculous. Because even should we win at the High Court, the government will appeal to the Court of Appeal. And if they should lose in the Court of Appeal, they will appeal to the Supreme Court. And if they lose in the Supreme Court, then they'll change the law so that the appeals couldn't happen in the first place. It seems to be a slight oversight when they passed the legislation and set up a special prescribed organisations appeal commission that didn't rule out doing an ordinary judicial review, which Mr. Chamberlain has pointed out to them, and I bet they're now sulking that no one back in Tony Blair's government in 2000 managed to think of that one. So it's just an update, really. Nothing has actually gone our way, but it's kept the stuff alive, and it keeps the campaign going, and it puts the cops in a difficult situation because they have to live with the possibility that it could all unravel, and all the people that they've arrested so far, and the more that they're planning to arrest, and boy, they've never had easier terrorist arrests in their history, might be queuing up to sue them afterwards. So yeah, generally a thumbs up to that one for the wigged up people. Well done.
Yeah, I mean, it all sounds incredibly positive. I assume there is going to be all kinds of roadblocks thrown up in the, as you say, because there's fairly terrible consequences for the government if this does go
Yeah,
wrong judicially.
but yeah, it's possible the government might have a rethink because
I mean, sorry, my
yeah,
skepticism I feel is well founded based on the more recent events. Um, yeah, no, I
yeah.
mean, yeah, it's obviously it sounds like good news, but in terms of it, like if it didn't go through, if they did find a roadblock or the judicial review goes badly, does that then go up another level towards sort of ECHR, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, once you've exhausted your domestic remedies, i.e., you can't appeal in this country anymore, and there are rules about getting permission for each level of appeal, so you might not even get as far as the Supreme Court. But once you've run out of appeals in your own country, you can go to Strasbourg and see if they will rule against the British government. Um, and that is a slow process, but there have been successes in the past where people have gone all the way to Europe
I mean,
and won.
I would think
Um,
it's worth it in Palestine Action's case, simply on the grounds that, what else are they going to do if they can't win it
exactly,
in the domestic basis?
yeah, and and obviously the situation gets worse by the day, and we might see that more than just public attitudes have changed by the time we get to that legal point.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the fact that Starmer, this is kind of not on our list other than kind of tangentially, but Starmer's um, switch to saying, well, maybe I will accept that Palestine is a country now, does seem to hint at least that he is um, nervous about the way that the public
Yeah,
position on Palestine has been moving. Um, I would not have expected him to do that even 6 months ago, really. I strongly get the impression actually that it's the pictures of starving kids, which we all, I mean, people who were really paying attention had already seen pictures of starving kids, but the fact that they managed to get into the mainstream press, uh, I think, it's the something about the callback to Live Aid has a really totemic effect, I think, on a lot of politicians in a way that almost nothing else does. You can say a genocide is happening. You can show pictures of a completely flattened Gaza City. You can even have pictures of kids with their limbs blown off. And it doesn't have the same impact as starving kids, the ribs showing through the skin, all this kind of stuff. It's a really odd psychological after effect, I think, that so much in many ways, so much more bloody brutality didn't cut through where starvation did. Got to be happy that something did, I suppose. Um,
yeah, it is the bloated bellies and the very scrawny limbs that really stick out as something that people don't imagine in, whereas you can imagine wounds and injuries in a much simpler way. And the fact that it's so much more deliberate to starve people to death than it is to blow them up if you were trying to blow someone else up
Yeah.
by mistake.
Yes, by
But yes,
mistake.
Starmer might not have registered all of that, but certainly his support base, and he might be starting to register that constantly doing unpopular measures that piss off his voters isn't doing him power of good. Um,
Well, that leads us onto our next agenda item, I believe, which is the Online Safety Act, which is currently the petition is hovering around the 437,000 signatures mark. I would expect it to go considerably higher over time. It's wildly unpopular, it seems. And again, I don't think, I think an awful lot of particularly guys will have had a sudden moment of what do you mean I have to prove my prove my age to watch porn. Um, but I think I think there is again like in terms of kind of psychological factors, there is something like banning an organization which consists of a couple of dozen people maybe, and it's that doesn't really affect me. And there's banning certain aspects of protests, which is very, oh well, as long as you're towing the line, then you shouldn't be getting arrested, even though the actual rules are clearly um, obscenely draconian. But there is something about a blanket. You can no longer do this, uh, and and you will have to jump through this hoop, um, and certain things are going to be banned by default. Uh, so like this very strongly affects um, the radical left as well as the radical right, in as much as we are very vulnerable to the likes of Facebook and Twitter, sorry, X, and the rest of them, basically just throwing all of our keywords and name types, anarchism, anarchist communism, yada yada, into the adults only section because it's extremism. And then anybody who is judged as below the age of 21 or whatever, that can no longer even see our content, no matter how fluffy it may be, right? Um, and there's nothing to stop that from being extended to, for example, trans people and trans liberation movements, if it isn't already, LGBT stuff, anything to do with women's bodies, the list goes on, right? Um, and it does seem to have gotten a lot of people riled because that is a much more blanket, we're just not going to show you this anymore, deal with it kind of approach than has previously been the case on the internet. Obviously, there have been multiple attempts to put this sort of act in place, all of which had been previously beaten because it's a bloody stupid idea.
yeah, it's hard to see where they're thinking of this. I mean, obviously, it's a government made up of school prefects who like banning things and saying what people can do, and that's very much part of it. But there's also, I think, the belief that they thought it would be very popular because they were doing something about child porn, and that then you get things like, God, and I hate myself for saying this, the absurd attack on Farage that he's supporting Jimmy Savile. Now he's many things, but
Just
he does not help if people go
cringeworthy.
patently untrue things about him that he can milk.
And it's also it's a like it's a direct call because you know where this comes from, right? Because we've all seen it online. Far right types who can't spell properly. Not that that's necessarily like an issue, but it does seem to be fairly consistent. Um, Go online, and if you are making any point that they disagree with. They say, "Oh, you're just a pedo defender," blah blah blah, and just some Labour won't going, we could apply this to Farage now because he's, talking about free speech. We could say defending paedophiles. It's like this is just this is the sort of thing which even Farage himself would would not do, as an accusation. Like and Farage does all kinds of terrible accusatory stuff. But the whole, if you disagree with me, you're a pedophile. Even he's not on that level, right? And it just makes them look pathetic. Um,
Yeah,
I genuinely astonished. I mean, I suppose not astonished because they've already, sunk to many depths over the last while. But it was a particular, like, wow, you've got no standards here at all, have you? Moment.
yeah. And I mean, I have not. I had a quick look at the 241 sections of the Act and the 17 schedules, which I defy anyone to get a proper grip on. Um, but it is hard to believe it is going to actually stop the real professional child molesters and spreaders of stuff. It's going to have a very strong effect on people who are casual internet users can't be bothered to get round the controls, and that's completely the opposite of effect of what both the intention is and what most people want done.
It's very not remembering what you were like as a teenager, I think, as well. This whole thing of, oh, well, if we put this little block up, then obviously nobody will be able to get around it. It's like anybody who knows how to purchase a VPN and install it knows how to get around it. And teenagers definitely know how to do that if they haven't already. The people who don't do that are older people, who the bill is not aimed at. And teenagers, if you tell them, "Hey, don't look at this," then obviously they're going to look at it. It's kind of, I can't think of anything more guaranteed to have teenagers looking at stuff you don't want them to look at than saying you can't look at this. Look at this thing that you're not allowed to look at. Um, but
Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously there's already been, famously there's already been an uptick in VPN purchases. And in fact, I was struggling to get onto my VPN today, and I suspect that's because so many people have signed up that they'll be struggling with the volume of it. Um, but yeah, I think it's one which obviously from our perspective as anarchists, there is a straightforward, this is yet another attack from an authoritarian leaning government on a form of free speech. Um, and we are 100% against it. Don't think it'll work in the same way as, banning drugs doesn't actually work to stop drugs. Um, and yeah, there's a good point made by our good friend Punk Academic saying, um, that it's also pushing LGBTQ plus content into restricted spaces and raises loads of issues for young people exploring their gender identity, which is absolutely true. It obviously will make it more difficult because the larger firms will be able to automate this process and they'll be able to make sure that they're on uh, even footing with the law. Smaller groupings and NGOs will very much struggle with this kind of stuff. I think the resources required will be difficult for them, and it will 100% be another avenue closed off to people who are exploring their identities in that way.
Yeah, it's a Section 28, and in many ways back again, not quite as crude, but having the same effect of marginalised groups get the problems. Groups that have strong backing, like the far right, will get round it, and that's yeah, very very annoying indeed. And it's just another great miscalculation by. Uh,
Yeah, I think a fairly clearly civil service led one. Like, I think there's one thing that is under counted in the way that Starmer acts. It's that he's very captured by the civil service. Like he keeps bringing forward all of these long-term civil, like so the civil service have been trying to get versions of the Online Safety Act into the public sphere for what? Pre-Theresa May. I'm pretty sure it was something which the coalition government were talking about at one point. So that would be what, early 2010s. Um, and they finally got it with Starmer because Starmer is prepared to actually push it through, even though it doesn't poll well. And this is along with a load of other stuff, like the increase in surveillance technology, which has quietly gone under the radar. That's been very much a civil service pushed thing. Um, they've been talking about identity cards as a renewed strategy as well, even though it's essentially obsolete tech by now. The expansion of all the databasing, the automation and expansion of border services, technology, all of this stuff is all the wish list for the civil service, particularly the Home Office wing of the civil service, and to less degree the police, I
well,
think. But
that's Starmer's background. He's constantly on about how he was a great director of public prosecutions. But the Crown Prosecution Service is just a branch of the civil service, a very inept branch, admittedly, even in a pretty stodgy service overall. But it's got the same mindset of small time bureaucracy filling up your days.
yeah.
And he
Uh,
likes that, basically. That's the way he thinks the world should be run.
Yeah, I mean, it's an odd mashup. The way it's sort of the blue Labour civil service position that he's found himself in, um, because yeah, it's very much almost anti-electoral in the way that it actually manifests. There's this kind of ongoing, obvious sense of disdain for what the public might think that goes on, which in some ways, like. Um, I think there's a certain aspect of how both the left and right would like their politicians to approach politics, which does say, oh well, the general public is not always right, and you shouldn't always follow what the general public says just by polls. Like there was that whole period, particularly the coalition, I think, but also through to maybe Theresa May, where the thick of it summed it up quite nicely as rule by polling. Whatever the polls said, they chased it, and they tied themselves up in not doing so. And this isn't what this government does to a great degree. Like to a point with chasing reform's own politics, but even so, like reform is running rings around Labour on this very topic, right? Because reform is smart enough to look at it and go, well, who is this for other than the civil service? Like, who is demanding this? Because it doesn't seem like the general public is. Um, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
I
it's
think,
it's adds another bow to the reform arrow, doesn't it? That um, every time that the government does something that's unpopular, that's basically bureaucratic, they say, well, look, it's no good changing to the Tories. You've got to have a whole new bunch of people who've got no experience of government whatsoever.
mm,
And we'll put some 18-year-olds in charge and you'll see some change. And if people get
yeah,
too fed up, then they will go for that.
yeah,
And that's
and I
worrying.
think this one, so it might work because I think Farage is going to gear up to make a big deal of it because it's an easy um, mallet to use on Labour. But I think that it's probably important that the left doesn't just do its uh, often it'll just do a knee jerk, oh, well, the far right is saying this and therefore we should say the opposite. And actually, this is a rare occasion in which our interests do dovetail very strongly. The left absolutely has nothing to gain from this act, and everything to gain from saying Farage is right, but for the wrong reasons. And Farage is doing it in a fully self-serving capacity. He's not doing it because he gives a damn about free speech, because as we know, free speech is attacked all the time, and Farage has no interest in it. You know, the prescription of Palestine Action being one good example of that. Others being, the closure of bank accounts belonging to pro-Palestine groups, which has been taking place. Farage has been completely ignoring it. Um, and yeah, like it's kind of, I think it is important for us to start hammering away at it, whilst also making it clear that the far right is not, you know, like it is A, not doing it for altruistic or politically sound reasons, and B, is not the only game in town in saying so. I actually think it's a sort of campaign which the new your party, or whatever it turns into, could make quite a lot of hay with, because it's the same, because it is, because one of the things that the liberals and right will go after your party on is saying they are a prototypical authoritarian left wing, socialisty organization. They support, you know, and then obviously this is only their characterization. They support the fundamentalists of Hamas, and they are, they probably go into Gaddafi and blah blah blah, whatever, and harp on Corbyn's admittedly sometimes uh, red shirt, my team, anti-imperialism of idiots approach. If you're going after free speech proactively, that's actually quite a good strategy for them potentially. Um, Not to tell left-wing political parties how to be more successful, but Um, but yeah, the I think the good news on this whole story is that I think that it has a very good chance of blowing up in Labour's face, and I think the Act has a good chance of being pushed into the long grass or into repeal of some kind. If not now exactly, it's
Yeah.
made very much for the next Parliament in some form or another a possibility, even
Certainly
under reform.
into enforcement, which is the easy path. They may simply avoid prosecutions, avoid um, getting themselves more publicity. Because if it just sits on the statute book and nothing much happens, then they might hope that it goes away.
Yeah. And of course, I have no doubt the police are none too pleased to have yet another intractable, massive online policing job to do on top of all the other stuff that they've been asked to do recently. Um,
Yeah, it is high level stuff for the cops as well, because I believe it involves keyboards and pressing buttons and stuff. And yeah,
what do you mean we can't bash anyone? Um, Okay, moving on. We've got a whole slate of freedom news stories which have been excellently written this week, starting with the TAV protests in Italy, which have been kicking off rather spectacularly. So, for people who don't know, the TAV is, I think I said earlier, the equivalent of HS2, but much larger. It's a line that runs all the way sort of north to south along Italy and into Austria and to Germany, I think. And there have been significant protests and camps and general pressure on governments for more than 30 years now. And this week we have an article by Gabriel Fontaine noting mass actions in which over 10,000 people marched. Protesters broke into three sites and destroyed construction materials and vehicles on the 26th of July. This is against the Turin-Lyon section of the line, or possibly that is the entire line. The movement's been very successful on the whole. It's repeatedly blocked attempts in the past. This is merely the most recent one. There are stories going back 15 years on the Freedom website about it. Um, yeah, seems to have been a very successful day out by all accounts, uh, and fairly proof positive that even when you have a far right government in power, which is prepared to pull all of the authoritarian levers at its disposal, it is possible to organise mass effective demonstrations that fuck shit up. Not to put too fine a point on it. Um, um, but yes, good, a very much good news story, I think, for the
Yay.
whether I think the thing, from our perspective, obviously HS2 has had a bit of a revival um, under Labour. I think they've been they agreed a little while ago to punt another however many billions of quid into it. Um, the actual HS2 movement, on the other hand, I think has been rather eclipsed, and this is not to knock the Palestine solidarity wing of things, but a lot of the activists that were involved in HS2 have moved into the pressing process of fighting genocide and Britain's contribution to it. And there are only a limited number of activists who get into that kind of thing. Obviously, the solution to this is to have more activists, but we can only work with what we've got. But that does mean that there's not been so much in the way of the camps and the organizing of that kind of odd mashup between NIMBYism, environmentalism, and direct actionism that was kind of characterizing the HS2 movement a few years ago. That's kind of fallen apart to a great extent, I think. And obviously to as well, an awful lot of what was going to happen along the route has now happened. So it's just lots of money being thrown at completing it. Um, but on the other hand, I think there's clearly still a huge groundswell of people who want to be involved in climate action, and who are increasingly are having avenues denied to them by government diktat, essentially. Um, this sort of thing, I think, is good for kind of you know bucking people up a bit and saying, well, actually, yeah, no, this is a possibility, and this is something which people can still be making a difference on, even if the Labour government has been, I struggle to say disappointing, but maybe predictably crap on.
But yeah, I mean, it is even possible in a country as lax as ours in activism compared to Italy that fracking was stopped. That was a serious success, and it was
Yep.
done by that combination of activists and NIMBYs. And being very very old, I grew up on the Doctor Who and the Green Death model that the unemployed miners work with the hippie commune to overthrow the plastics factory and its evil computer. And it is about building alliances between lots of different people who, at the end of the day, and this is one we do harp on about, is have the same interest in having an ecologically sustainable planet in which everyone can live in peace and harmony. It's not a minority interest to get that, and the alternative is going to be in everyone else's really really bad interest. So there is motivation as well as encouragement in what's happening in Italy. That's good to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a good point to make in terms of uh, the need to kind of make these alliances with groupings that you don't necessarily always have natural connections to. It's actually like a conversation I was having online the other day was someone saying, I don't understand why it is that the left is so defensive of Muslims, and why it is that you get this kind of Muslim left um, sort of meshing when when the Islamic faith has all of these reactionary elements to it, which particularly when it comes to women, etc., etc. And sort of saying, well, first of all, obviously, there is Muslims are not all of one mind. There is a huge spectrum between fundamentalist Islam and the fact, we would try. There's no leftist who would find it easy to work with fundamentalist Islam. I think it's reasonable to say, um, and kind of moderate Muslims and all the rest of it. But also, there is an obvious process that happens, right, where Muslims come into Britain and they are attacked by the far right, and the left, in its best form, um, fights for the rights of the underdog. That is a thing that the left prides itself on doing. And it doesn't matter whether we entirely agree with everything that Muslim preachers have to say or whatever. Um, what matters is that these are people who are being attacked by fundamentally reactionary, dominant social forces that we need to stand between them and the people who they are about to try and repress. But the thing that happens when you do that is that you provide a good example, and you provide a example of solidarity, which Muslims then connect to. Obviously, in the same way as gays, lesbians, and lesbians support the miners, right? The same thing where you're not necessarily on the same wavelength to start with, but the fact that you're showing solidarity means that there's crossover and people discussing things and coming to similar conclusions, and you end up with like a big section of um, the Muslim population in Britain with left sympathies because you know solidarity breeds solidarity and discussion and kind of people taking on board each other's ideas. And the same thing occurs when you're talking about climate solidarity and bringing in NIMBYism, is that the people who are fighting for the fields and trees that they love about where they live will take on board climate change arguments and the broader arguments because you're both standing against the same fundamental process under those circumstances. I think it's
Yes,
something
I
which
think.
is under underappreciated when it comes to how the left has to build its coalitions and alliances, and indeed recruit more leftists. Um,
Hmm. Well, this is good because when all our internet is shut down and we can't just talk to each other, we might have to go out in the street and meet other people and engage them in debate.
do you
You
mean
never
we're not?
know.
Are you saying we won't be able to just say to them, either you agree with me 100%, or I'm cutting you out of my life entirely? That
Could
seems
be.
very early 2000s, Andy. I'm not sure it's going to work. Um, Not to say that we didn't have horrifying arguments into the 2000s. Um, anyway, moving on. Uh, so, what do we have? It's on the list.
Oh,
We've got the TAV protest, the uptick in far right protest, and we've kind of already touched on this, but this obviously there have been a number of larger protests, particularly in Epping and also in Norwich, and there are attempted ones which have been taking place in London and Manchester. Um, Some of this is obviously seasonal because you get an awful lot of the football hooligan crowd get bored around this time because the football's no longer on, and they start to organise, you know, uh, protests and attempts at starting a ruck, slightly more strategic attempts to kick off with the cops, etc., etc., and also to a degree there's a kind of summer series of more family friendly attempts as well, which have also been taking place. The Norwich one, for example, was much more family friendly in what it was trying to do, although obviously these things always bring through the usual suspects, people who are Sig Heiling in the background, which stand up to racism can always highlight in photos. Um, There's a good quote from Blade Runner, who has written a decent article about this, uh, which I would pick out, saying, unlike previous far right eruptions in Britain, seeing, for example, Bradford in 2001, Dover in 2016, today's racist outrage is more rapidly mobilised, digitally coordinated, and openly backed by political forces, whipping up nationalist tension. The far right increasingly co opts the language and aesthetics of protest, but in service of white supremacy. And I think that's very true. This is something which we have seen in previous iterations of the far right, I think. I remember in the early 2000s, there was a uh, protest aesthetic that they tried on for a little while, but it didn't kind of take off really. This time around, I think it is being much more successful. And it is drawing on an ability to protest outside hotels and draw a broader set of the far right equivalent of swappy anoraks, um, who will turn out in larger numbers and be a bit better behaved than the bald, middle-aged fighters, essentially. Um,
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, bald middle-aged fighters who got a typical 2.5 year violent disorder sentence for the last round, the 40% release date, they'll be coming out now, ready for action again. So that's interesting to note the statistic that 40% of those convicted for the riots last summer were also under investigation for domestic abuse, which shows exactly where their violence is situated and coming from. But the problem this time is, whereas what happened at Southport was a single incident that was deliberately misinterpreted, and then the follow on stuff. This time we've got a situation where Starmer again promised that he would stop the boats, he would smash the gangs and solve the problem. And instead of saying, well, no, we're going to welcome these people as refugees, and standing firm, or stopping the refugees from coming. He said he would, and he hasn't, and therefore there is a basis of complaint. Not one we'd agree with, but you can see that they've got a much stronger position this time to get people involved. And of course, there are knock-on effects when you're only going to be putting the asylum seekers in certain areas that affect certain people and not very near to where most middle class Labour MPs live. And so, yeah, again, we've got a government that's played into the far right's hands, which is frustrating.
yeah, 100%. I think it's a good point about the fighters coming out later this summer, presumably, or coming out sort of from around now. One of the things I think that the far right often struggles because people just don't want to associate themselves with that stereotype, right? The jackbooted, um, paramilitary style thuggery. And whenever those types show up, it puts regular, gripey racists off. Um, this summer, there's been the lead in which these people have not been showing up to the protests because a lot of them have been in jail. And I can't help but think that maybe that's actually been working in the favor of the kind of larger protests in the initial stages. Whether this will mean that when they come out and start causing trouble again, everyone will uh, abandon the protests, or whether the protests will benefit from a sense of we've already got the mass or the larger numbers and therefore the legitimacy and we want to keep going, I think is an open question under those circumstances. I mean, obviously, from the left and anti-fascist perspective, we have a serious lack of energy to take on those numbers or indeed take on the fighters as and when they come out. It's an ongoing problem that we are essentially reliant on the far right being incompetent and destroying itself, which has been the case for a while and is a not really a position we want to be in. But there's obviously a major difficulty that the left continues to be on the back foot. I'll be interested to see whether the uh, energy around Corbyn, Corbynism 2.0, your party, etc., will re-energize people to become more directly active again. Obviously, coming at it from a history of 2015 onwards thing, we had an initial burst of enthusiasm, which kind of fed into some stuff, including elements of anti-fascism, I think, but didn't hold up for very long. And then people ended up, as we predicted, burning themselves out on electoralism, which left us in a more dire position after electoralism fell apart and Starmer took power and all the rest of it. Um, it's a hard one to judge, or I mean, it's impossible to do the Nostradamus Act, I suppose, to say what will happen in terms of a rejuvenated Your Party and its impact on what needs to happen, which is the rebuilding of left community and a living culture of collectivity and resistance. Like, I am generally an optimist on this stuff, partly because I think being a pessimist is a road to burnout. But I do think, particularly because the online arguing and, backbiting and people scrapping all the time amongst the left seems to be in mild decline, mild being the operative word, certainly anecdotally. Um, that does open the door for something to happen. I'm seeing more groups around where I live, which are left wing and active and not arguing necessarily. At worst, they're kind of ignoring each other, um, which is probably, the best that can be asked for. But there's more of them and there's more energy to them. Um, how far that'll go or where, I suppose, is the big $1 million question.
Yeah, that's good bit of Gramsci there. Optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect. Uh, but yeah, it, to be frankly honest, stopping Nazis is a very difficult thing and a very dangerous one. And I have great respect for anyone who's willing to go out and do it. But it does need to be done. And as the old saying goes, if you can't beat them in a fist fight, you have to fight a world war. And it gets very very messy indeed.
Yep. Uh, which leads us on a sort of similar note of activism. Is it on an uptick? Trans Pride this year was actually very successful, it seems. Uh, Big protest, lots and lots of people showing out, lots of vitality and energy to it. We had another article by Blade Runner on it, which is very good, talking about how it was building on last year's momentum. Um, I Obviously there was a relative to complete lack of media interests, even amongst left media. Obviously, the Morning Star, with its uh, somewhat iffy, to say the least, position on trans rights, um, I didn't really touch it all that much. I think there was a couple of very minor reports. The Guardian didn't say very much, um, but it was an interesting example of reviving the more anti-corporate aspects of Pride, the historic anti-corporate aspects. And this is obviously because corporations, even more so than with Pride, have essentially decided, no way, we want nothing to do with this. This is not a thing we can sell, we can make money on. So it leaves room for the more directly anti-capitalist positioning, which I think can only be a good thing. I think it's very interesting that Trans Pride is a good hub position for radicalism in that sense, in that kind of gathering people together just to be radically minded. Essentially, it's not, there's demands to be made of the government under those circumstances, but precious little in terms of um, delusions that the government has any interest, I think. Which means that there's, like the march itself becomes an organizational focus, a demonstration, and a kind of a communal gathering in a useful way, I suppose.
Yeah, it's been, I think, for a lot of younger trans people, an incredible shock having been brought up in our education system for the last 20 years that has gone around talking about equality, inclusion, and not being prejudiced. And then suddenly to find out that the government bows into a small and ridiculous pressure group to be completely prejudiced against them. And that must be a horrible thing, as we know, but also a shocking thing that exposes the state as basically lying and fibbing about all these values that they've so-called got, but they don't really apply. And so, yeah, as so often, it's when the state comes down against you that you hit the really swift learning curve, rather like the NIMBYs, if you like.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's good to see it going strong. I should mention on the legal hat on again, there's further judicial reviews planned on the stupid Supreme Court judgment and how it's going, more importantly, how it's going to be implemented as they realise how ridiculous a situation it's left um, all manner of people in. But then, yeah, the doubt and the fear goes on from that, unfortunately.
Yeah. But well done, everybody, for turning out, and hopefully everyone had a great time. This leads us on to the Handala being intercepted. So this is back on the Gaza, subject of Gaza. So this is yet another boat that's been pirated by the IDF. And everybody, there's various people who were refusing expedited deportation. So they have been on hunger strike in prison, I think. Last I saw, I don't know whether they've been released yet. It's been these projects, obviously, in terms of actually getting the aid to Gaza, they have been very much on a hiding into nothing because the IDF is absolutely not going to let them through. But they do consistently highlight in a way which I think is useful the fact that these blockades exist. Like there's obviously the blockade, or the land blockade is, if anything, even worse and is blocking UN aid. You have paramilitary groupings destroying food and toiletries and baby formula rather than let them through. And those are very shocking images, but they don't tend to make the news very often. Whereas relatively celeb Westerners, in the most cynical of ways, will make the evening news when they get arrested. And I think that that kind of demonstration is another added pressure to governments and indeed to Israel itself, much as Israel tends to ignore these things. Um, but yes, that's I suppose that's just a quick one, essentially on that. And that leaves us with anti-corruption protests in the Ukraine is the final story from Freedom, which, as we are getting towards the hour, we can rattle through quickly. This is by Nikita Ivansky, and the story is essentially thousands of people taking to the streets around Ukraine to protest against a new bill that would remove the independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and essentially fold. Oh, I think we may have lost Andy. Fold the functions of the Ukraine anti-corruption organizations into the broader government. It destroys their ability to properly investigate corruption. This is so it's an ongoing issue, and the people may remember, or some people have been following it for a while, may remember in I think this is pre-war 2015, 16 maybe. There was a BBC documentary in which uh, there's a really astonishing scene in which the BBC is interviewing the anti-corruption czar of the Ukrainian government at the time, and a senior Ukrainian uh, member of the governing party pushes into the office and gives the anti-corruption czar a dressing down for essentially investigating the wrong thing in front of the BBC crew. Um, and this kind of really sets the scene for me, certainly, in terms of the way that the Ukrainian government has been wildly corrupt since well before the war started. And Zelensky's actions are really, they're nothing new in the sense that the Ukrainian government has been this level of corrupt for a long time. And he's kind of just trying to smooth over or head off or undercut attempts to change the situation. Um, and it's something which, uh, you know, solidarity with Ukraine as a people, the Ukrainian people, the people of Ukraine, shouldn't and doesn't get in the way of saying the Ukrainian government is authoritarian, it's corrupt, it's, a government. It's the same sort of thing that anarchists are always against. So it should be of no surprise to see that the same people doing things like Operation Solidarity are also fully on board with saying, yeah, this is an example of deep corruption within the Ukrainian state, and uh, the Ukrainian people certainly deserve better. But also, you can't take your foot off the pedal in terms of challenging the Ukrainian state and its actions simply because it is able to call on, well, we're defending against a far greater evil. States always do this, even in peacetime. And even within parties, obviously, as we know, the Labour Party in the UK saying, if you don't keep showing your loyalty to us, then maybe reform will get in. It's a nonsense on any level that this happens. And I think that solidarity with anti-corruption activism should be as important as solidarity with uh, avoiding Putinism taking root uh, in Ukraine as a whole.
Yeah, it's neither Moscow nor Kiev, but international anarchism.
Yes, indeed. It's well worth reading the full article because it goes into a little more detail on what Bill 12414 is about, and talks and sort of what the protesters are saying. So I think that pretty much rounds us off. There was food inflation accelerating again. This was an FT story. This is our FT story of the week. This is food inflation has risen for the 6 month running and is now at over 4%. This is just a very brief highlight of it, really, in as much as we know, inflation is a kind of an aggregate of lots of different aspects of the weekly basket, as they like to put it. But food, as Jack Monroe was very effective at one point at pointing out, is something which is much more keenly felt, obviously, by everybody, particularly on the lower end of the scale of the pay scale. So yeah, everybody will be feeling this. I think it's another one of these ones where the left has really forgot developers just showing blatant corruption and cartel behavior is just skipped over in the mainstream news and isn't picked up on by the left press, or it isn't, focused on by the left press, because the left press is busy chasing a lot of the time the mainstream news agenda, um, of whatever it is, and forgets that these are the things which are actual bread and butter. Like saying, look, you need to look at the food prices because food prices are important to working class people. So why aren't we campaigning directly on food prices? Why aren't we asking 6 months in a row of increasing inflation? Like not just increasing RPI, but the rate at which RPI is going up is also increasing. Um, and this stuff is what really matters to people because it's directly their pocket that gets hit. And why is our food prices increasing again at a higher rate? Like the FT is talking about a squeeze on global supplies, particularly for meat and tea. But as we know, like prices on all kinds of stuff like potatoes, crisps are wildly more expensive than they were a couple of years ago. Chocolate, um, fresh fruit has risen. Like all of these things are, some of them are kind of the little treats that make life worth living sometimes, right? Um, but yeah, this kind of stuff needs more analysis directly from. This is something which the left could do via academia, actually. Like one of the things that we lack is we have left economists, but they talk about the broad picture, right? Like, but what they don't drill down to a lot of the time is those kind of individual topics and why and kind of what we need to be considering about them. Like the interviews which Aaron Bastani does on Novara Media, for example, they're often they're US focused or they're tariff focused or they're kind of, big picture stuff. And that's grand. But they don't really talk about kind of the nitty gritty of how people are being affected in day to day terms, what their daily basket looks like, and indeed ways in which they can get around it. Like, there's all kinds of things that you can look at and work on. Like I'm a member of a food co-op, for example, a whole food co-op, in which they so the way it works is that you all gather together into a big buyers collective, and you then go to a wholesaler and you buy direct at wholesale prices, which cuts the price way down. Obviously, there's a few costs which you end up paying, perhaps storage or whatever, but these are projects which can directly impact on the costs, on the point of purchase costs for working class people, and they are at the moment, they are broadly, I think it's fair to say, a minority pastime that are done by the same sorts of people who live in housing co-ops or who, work on allotments or whatever, and they don't have the broad appeal that they really should. But these kind of play into aspects of our collectivist mindset, which should be the sort of thing that we push much more strongly to the people around us, to the local communities that could stand to benefit most directly from them. Um,
Yeah, it's inflation is the equivalent of a regressive poll tax, in effect. It charges everyone, but instead of the government being seen to actually go and directly rob your money, it looks a lot easier for the capitalists to redistribute wealth in their favor if prices have gone up. Oh, they've gone up for everyone, and it looks like it's something that's affecting you individually if you're buying stuff individually, which is obviously why we're arguing for a collective response.
yeah, it's what is it? The an increase in food prices hits the basket of rich and poor alike. Uh, but on which note, I think we are pretty much out of agenda items for today. So I think it's probably time to ring off. Thank you very much, Andy, for as ever, insights and interesting comments. Thank you everybody for watching, and we shall see you again next time.